Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 116, and this is for our class for October 20th, Monday, where we are putting closure onto short story and moving forward into drama. You'll remember we had talked also a little bit about paper number one and how ultimately I wanted to give an extension until the 29th, which is Wednesday, but certainly you're encouraged to submit in early papers. And what we were talking about in terms of short story were different kinds of approaches. The last short story that I have for us, Popular Mechanics, is a minimalist approach, which means less is more. And we've certainly seen something like this with Soldier's Home, but it's taken to the extreme by Raymond Carver, who is the author of Popular Mechanics. And of course, the title in and of itself is unusual. Popular is something that is commonplace. And mechanics, lots of definitions for mechanics, one of them being two forces that work against one another, which will be appropriate for this particular piece. Popular Mechanics is also the name of a publication. It was a magazine, and I believe it still exists. But nevertheless, it was a magazine about how to make and fix things. And this is an ironic title because the story is the exact opposite. It's about how to break things. And you might have noticed, I hope you noticed, that when you were reading this particular story, there is no use of quotation marks around dialogue, which of course violates grammatical rules. And it's not that the author didn't know about grammatical rules, very deliberately decided to leave off the quotation marks, and we could even generate an entire paper as to why. Certainly, when we speak with one another, we don't necessarily use grammatical structures, so that might give this piece a sense of realism. It's also difficult to differentiate the dialogue. And in the end, the reality is that we've got two parents who are fighting, who are putting the welfare of themselves over the welfare of their child. So their individual responses are really irrelevant. And as I have always argued with this piece, what we really get is almost like a set of instructions about how to end a relationship where there is yelling and profanity. And I suggest that you don't need quotation marks around that because this is pretty much the dialogue that's used. Some of the words or phrases might vary from couple to couple, but this is pretty much what is said. So there's nothing unusual or in any way unique about what this couple is saying. Note that we're not told what they're arguing about because honestly, it's irrelevant. All that truly matters is the welfare of the child, something that they don't consider as they continue their quest with trying to achieve power over the other. The setting, we're very, in the very beginning, told that it's dark and that there's a little shoulder high window that faces the backyard. This is or the back. This is a very different kind of window than the window we might have seen in The Story of an Hour with Mrs. Chopin, I'm sorry, with Mrs. Mallard by Kate Chopin, where we see a sense of expansiveness that, when we're told it's getting dark on the inside too, it's literal as well as figurative. And the foreshadowing occurs when they first argue over the picture of the baby. Of course, you can't break a picture into two without ruining it. And that's what ends up happening at the very ending of the story. They shatter a flower pot before that, so they've killed something that's alive. And they're in the kitchen, which is usually considered to be a place of safety and family. But as they're arguing, they are holding that child over the stove, a very dangerous place, as the child is in obvious distress, crying and red faced. And as they both argue over the child, you might be reminded of a biblical story, the story of Solomon, because this story is definitely a modern take on the story of Solomon. And the biblical story of Solomon is that King Solomon was approached by two women who both claimed to be the biological mother of a child. And Solomon, in order to resolve the dispute, suggested that they split the child in two and each woman could have half of the child. And the biological mother steps forth and says, no, let the other woman have the child in its entirety. And King Solomon says to the woman who stepped forth, You must be the biological mother because you're willing to put the welfare of your child above your own needs and desires. So, the moral or the lesson of that is that a true parent is selfless when it comes to the raising of their children. This piece, Popular Mechanics, written in the early 80s, where it's becoming much more popular, if you will, to have divorce, illustrates what happens in divorce and that neither parent is selfless enough to think about the welfare of the child. So when we're told at the end this issue is decided, even though we don't want this ending, the reality is that they tear that child in two. This is a modern telling of the story of Solomon. And while one certainly hopes that the tearing of a child in two is not literal in our contemporary society, we certainly see this happen on an emotional level with children as they are forced to choose loyalties between one parent or another, or even forced to choose residences for part of the week and then the other part of the week. So I ended with Popular Mechanics, which was initially entitled Mine, by the way, and that title probably makes a lot more sense, but I prefer actually the title Popular Mechanics. Carver made a judgment call to call it something that was a little bit less obvious, and I think it requires some thought and some consideration from the reader, which is always a good thing. But I end with this piece, not that this is the ending of short story, obviously not. We could spend an entire semester reading short stories, but we have to move on. And that means that we are moving on to our next unit. And our next unit happens to be drama. And ideally, drama is viewed live, and drama is all dialogue based. Obviously, because of the logistical difficulties involved, we won't be watching these dramas live. Not necessarily a bad thing, considering this is a literature and film class, so watching films performances might make some more sense. But as we talked about with Citizen Kane and with all film, it basically, there are multiple layers involved in that the camera basically dictates what it is that we see or what we don't see in a way that you wouldn't necessarily find in a live stage performance. So you need to keep that in mind as we're watching these filmed productions. In terms of drama, the textbook gives you some suggestions on how to approach it. Remember that dramas are ultimately meant to be performed, but if you've got a well-written drama, something that qualifies in my mind as literature, it can be read and dissected just like any other piece. And think about how we could do the same with film. We could actually read the script of Citizen Kane and review it the way we would review a piece of literature. So, a couple of suggestions to you as you're reading drama, which might seem again a bit odd because we're used to performance, but in this class we'll do both. We will both read the drama and watch a performance, and one does not in any way negate the other. So you need to do both in this particular instance. When you are reading drama, the stage directions are particularly important. They are usually written in italics, and you might be tempted to skip them, but I can tell you this is the only way for you to visualize what the author's vision would be for the performance of their play. Some playwrights give lots of stage directions, as we will see with The Raisin and the Sun, and some playwrights give very, very little. But do take time to read those stage directions and to visualize the setting. Also take time to read the character names right before dialogue, and those will also probably be in italics as well. And you'll be likely to skip those because you want to get to the content of the piece. But if you don't take time to read those names and visualize these different individuals, you are going to get confused as to who is speaking. Of course, it's much easier when you're watching a performance because you've got different actors, different appearances, different wardrobe. We don't have that luxury when we are reading a drama. And of course, thinking about titles, and the textbook gives you an example of a drama that is kind of unusual because dramas are usually longer. And That said, the example that they give us about reading a drama is a short drama, just one act. It's called Trifles. And they use it as an example of how to read drama, the importance of reading the stage directions and the importance of reading the character names. And the title Trifles means things that are seemingly unimportant. The plot of this play is that law enforcement with their wives come to a murder scene, an abandoned farmhouse, and law enforcement is trying to find clues to determine who the murderer was and what the motive might be. And it turns out the wives, when they're left alone, and note that this piece was written in the early 1900s, so it's very much a piece written by Susan Glaspell about gender. The women, when they're left alone, are able to look at trifles, hence the title, little clues that would be seemingly unimportant on the surface, and pull together the answer that the murderer is the wife and that she did so because she was the victim of domestic abuse. And then the major question for the women is, do they share this information with their spouses, who also are law enforcement, or do they keep it to themselves? And I won't tell you. I guess you have to read the play. But nevertheless, it's a short enough play so that you could actually turn it into a short story. And I believe the most recent edition of the textbook has retained Trifles as both a play and a short story. Obviously, the telling of it will be different. One of the advantages of fiction is that you can often express character thoughts, which is a lot trickier in a drama. A character can speak their thoughts out loud, or perhaps they could share their thoughts with another character. But it's not as easy as, let's say, a short story where he thought or she thought, something of that nature. So the elements of a drama, and I've already mentioned the idea of an act. Those are the main divisions in a play, because plays are longer, so they usually have multiple divisions. Scenes, those are divisions within the acts themselves to denote something like a new location or a new character. Subplot, so you might not have just one story, you might have multiple stories. And do trust me, if that's the case, they are all related to one another, even if on the surface they don't seem to be related to one another. The stage directions, and that's the information for the director and the actors on how to put forth the production. And expect a rise and fall of action, almost like a pyramid. When you move up a pyramid, you get to the top of the pyramid and then a descent. So much so that when we get to Shakespeare, we'll talk about 5 acts, and we can even predict where each act will occur. But we're not beginning with Shakespeare. We're beginning with a terribly old play, 430 BC from Greece, which begs the question, why would we read something that's that old and that is that far removed from our culture, that was originally written in Greek, so we have to rely on a translation in English. And I've read many translations and seen many translations. I've never seen or read in the original because I'm not fluent in Greek. In my mind, I've never truly read this play. Oedipus the King is its name, and that is part of the problem when you're reading a translation, is you're never going to get an accurate version, but you'll get something that's close enough. And one of the additional challenges of Oedipus the King is that it was written in poetry. As you know, poetry relies on sound. And not only do you have challenges when you're translating to find a word that has a comparable meaning in another language, but it becomes even more complex if you're looking for a word with the comparable sound. So usually what you've got to do is have a good amount of compromise. And different versions of Oedipus will be slightly different. So the link that I'm providing you for Oedipus the King will be different than the textbook version, will be different than the film version we're seeing. But Oedipus the King is important, probably mostly because it helps to establish tragedy and the tragic tradition. And because of the importance of time period, we do need to talk about what was available or not available for production with theater, which would influence how the story was told. Just a little bit of information, as you can see in the notes below in the 5th section, about Sophocles, the author of Oedipus the King. He was a statesman, he was a general, he was a dramatist, and there are only really a handful of plays that are still intact. There are lots of fragments, and luckily Oedipus the King is one of them. And it's part of a trilogy, actually. It's a three-part story. We're reading the first part, Oedipus the King, which is about a king named Oedipus. The second play is entitled Antigone, which is the story of Oedipus's grown daughter. And the third play, Oedipus at Colonus, we revisit Oedipus years later when he's an old man. But the good news is that you can read the first play and it stands as an individual unit. One of the ways that we think of Oedipus the King as being so important is that there was the introduction of a third actor on stage, giving dialogue at the same time, which leads us to the theaters. The theaters were Greek amphitheaters, and they were basically rows of seats that were built into hillsides and rocks that could seat over 14,000 people. So you can imagine the magnitude. In fact, in the notes below, I've got a brief video for you to watch to give you a sense of what the amphitheater would have looked like. It's just 4 minutes or so, and it's under the 7th section. And they were marvels of acoustics, but even still, you can imagine some of the challenges with not having electricity, for instance, and not having microphones, for instance, and not having screens, for instance, or lighting, for instance. So there were a lot of theatrical conventions that would seem quite odd to us at the time, that we are watching it in 2025, that wouldn't seem odd at all to an audience in 430 BC, especially because dramas were considered to be religious festivals as well as pieces of entertainment, specifically to the god Dionysus, the god of wine and fertility. And they were considered so important that they were actually funded by the state because they could reinforce religious and community values as well. So, some of the odd ways that we might see a production then as compared to now is that the actors would be wearing large masks that would help us differentiate the different actors on stage. And also, there were probably amplification devices within the mask, even though the amphitheater itself was a marvel of acoustics. They would wear large padded costumes that would be very colorful. They would wear platform shoes, and they would have something called a chorus. If you're familiar with Broadway shows, you might be familiar with the chorus, where you've got a group of people who are singing at the same time. Instead, in Greek drama, you've got a group of people who are chanting at the same time, but it sounds musical. It's almost like a soundtrack. And that group of people could stand as almost like the extras in a film, if you will. They could represent the community, but they could also serve as narrator, and they could summarize action, which would be useful again if you happen to miss part of the play. What perhaps is one of the oddest conventions of the time is that the plot would have been known ahead of time by the audience. So we are going to be talking about the plot, which means that you were watching a performance not for the unveiling of the plot, you were watching it for its acting and for the interpretation. And Oedipus the King is one of the best known literary examples of irony. And the irony is obvious because we know what Oedipus, our main character, does not, which I'll get back to in a little bit. Some of the other conventions of the time, something called Deus Ex Machina, which meant God from the machine. Those were just mechanical stage devices, so it would be comparable, I suppose, to some of the special effects we might have today. And the amphitheater video that I'm asking you to watch discusses that a little bit, where you would have pulleys and ropes, for instance, so you could lower a character onto stage or perhaps raise them up. So you could lower a character from the heavens onto stage, or perhaps you could raise a character into heaven from the stage. Now it's just come to mean in contemporary times, Deus Ex Machina, any artificial way of giving a resolution to a particular story. Think about, let's say, after you've invested time and effort into a long story to find out that the entire tale was a dream. So that's considered to be Deus Ex Machina, a kind of artificial means to put resolution. I've seen it done well, I've seen it done badly. So the idea is that this play is highlighted as perhaps the best example of tragedy that existed up to that time. It's used as the template. And it was, of all people, Aristotle, the great philosopher, who also dabbled in literary criticism, informally, albeit, who talked a little bit about what a great tragedy should have. And that was the reading on tragic character that I had suggested, that a tragedy should be complex. We've talked about this with literature. Literature should be complex, or else it's formulaic and not worth our study. It should be about terrible and piteous events, or else it's not tragic. It's comedic or something else. And you have what's known as a tragic hero, which is a great individual above and beyond the ordinary, someone who is better than any of us in the audience, someone we can respect and admire, who experiences a downfall because of two factors. The first, a flaw or flaws in character. So there are errors that the character commits to help bring about their downfall. So part of this is an instructional vehicle for us about what not to do in our own lives. Because if that character could fall so far and they are much superior to us, imagine how far we could fall. And the major flaw usually is hubris, which is excessive pride and arrogance. Though we will see with Oedipus the King that there are multiple flaws, but the major one would be hubris. Also, outside forces, things beyond our control, oftentimes referenced as fate, or in contemporary times we might talk about it as destiny or luck, something that you cannot control. And this great man, because they are good people, accept responsibility for their fall in part because they helped bring it about. So they accept responsibility for their flaws. And we, as audience, are supposed to feel pity. After all, this was a good person, and it wasn't completely their fault. There were outside forces to play. And also fear. If this person could fall so far, we can fall at least as far, if not farther. The characters, which is, I think, very sensical, need to be basically necessary and engage in probable actions. They need to be as realistic as possible within the fictional world that we're being presented in the drama. And yet another reason why we read Oedipus the King, outside of its importance as a tragic story, is because of Sigmund Freud, who you may know from psychology, oftentimes credited as the father of psychology, who was inspired by this play, Oedipus the King, to name one of his most famous theories loosely on Oedipus the King's plot. His theory is called the Oedipal complex, the idea that all sons have some sort of sexual attraction to their mothers and see their fathers as kind of competition. There also is something called an Electra complex, by the way, which is the exact opposite, where the daughters have some sort of attraction to the fathers and see their mother as competition. And Freud's theories have fallen out of favor, but nevertheless, the Oedipal complex has probably influenced or probably has been the reason why most people know of Oedipus the King. And it has influenced certainly psychology as well as literature. So in that respect, it's important. And even though it's an old play that is from a different culture, I would suggest that many of the themes that are being addressed within the play are still applicable today. But of course, you'll have to read the play and we'll have to watch a performance so that you can make the decision for yourself. I've given in the notes below the link for Oedipus the King, as well as for the upcoming dramas as well, because I can tell you what's ideal, though the world isn't always ideal, I'm well aware, but what would be ideal is, as we were talking about Oedipus the King, we've got multiple classes devoted to it. You are reading the next play, which happens to be A Midsummer Night's Dream by Shakespeare. And then as we are talking about and watching A Midsummer Night's Dream, and we'll have multiple classes devoted to that, you are reading the next drama, which is Raisin in the Sun. And I think you'll find that Raisin in the Sun is a much more accessible play. It is set in America in the 1950s, and that's much more contemporary than, let's say, a Shakespearean play, which would be set in England in the late 1500s. But even that is more contemporary than something like Oedipus the King, which was set in Greek society in 430 BC. So this is what's coming up, but I also know that you're thinking about a paper. So again, I'm hoping that your paper will be due or will be submitted by the 29th, and which puts us approximately midway through the semester. That said, there isn't any reason why you couldn't hand in your paper early or hand in your paper after the 29th, because I do have rolling deadlines. That said, if you haven't submitted in a paper by the 29th, I do ask that you come keep me apprised. You tell me what's happening and when you think you will submit in that paper. That paper, approximately 4 to 5 pages, but approximately is approximately, as long as it needs to be for you to support your particular thesis. And you'll remember that I supplied you with some paper topic questions, or you could create your own paper topic as long as you get it approved by me and as long as it's in relation to one of the texts that we're reading. And the topics that I had suggested to you were either examining canon, should something, one of the texts we're reading or watching, because we've talked about film as a literary text as well. Should that be included or not included in the literary canon, and why? And note, there is no right or wrong answer here. It's more about your argumentation. Or you could talk about contemporary relevance, and does the text have or not have contemporary relevance? And while contemporary relevance is oftentimes an element of canon, there are many more elements that are associated with it. So you can focus just on contemporary relevance. But if you do, remember that the paper is about the text and not necessarily about contemporary times. So while you can reference contemporary times, you don't want to lose control of the paper, which is an analysis of a literary text, where you would be using paraphrase and quotation from the text itself in order to support your arguments. And you would document that. And we had talked a little bit about this, about some of the conventions for documentation in previous classes. And immediately after a quote, what we use is the MLA system, Modern Language Association. We use parentheses to indicate the least amount of information necessary to identify where that quote can be found. Usually that's something like a page number, but you might need to add additional pieces of information if it's unclear, such as the name of the author, or even the name of the author in the text if you've got text by multiple authors. And then what you do is you close your parentheses and then you end your punctuation. And if you are quoting from a film, you would use a timestamp instead. The way the system usually works is you include a works cited page at the ending of your paper where you list all of the works that you cited or quoted in your paper. And they're all listed by alphabetical order and by author surname. And there's slightly different conventions for how you might indicate a book as opposed to a magazine article, as opposed to a website. So you just follow the directions of the MLA. And as I had indicated, since this is a critical paper, you aren't doing outside research, that what I suggest is that you don't necessarily even need to submit in a works cited page, though certainly if you do submit in a works cited page, you want it to be done correctly, so make sure that you're following the conventions. And I had given you some links of the GCC library and also Purdue OWL to help you with that if you so wanted. But you definitely have to use documentation within the paper itself, which is what today's attendance question is going to be. So even though we've begun with the idea of drama, and we will continue talking about drama over the next several classes, the textbook even gives you some questions to consider when you're writing about drama. And the good news is that those questions are very similar to the kinds of questions that you would ask yourself when you are writing about, let's say, short story or fiction or film, with, of course, some changes, for instance, thinking about things like stage directions, if you will. So today's attendance question is going to directly address paper number 1. And my question, which would be due by Wednesday, and that said that if you need additional time, please let me know. I'll be happy to grant it to you. What do you think you will write paper number 1 about, and why? What do you think you will write paper number 1 about, and why? And of course, you're not committed necessarily at this particular point, but I want to push you to start thinking about how you could address that first paper. So, next class, we will talk a little bit more about Oedipus the King. In fact, we will see a production about Oedipus the King. And what I wanted to do was just very briefly give you the plot of Oedipus the King, because again, as you're watching a production, you need to know the plot, what's happening. Audiences would have. So basically, the play begins in medias res, which means in the middle. Oedipus, a great king, is confronted with a plague that is decimating the population. So he, as a good man and a good king, wants to do everything within his power to stop the plague. The assumption, remember this is Greek society, so it's a time of the gods, is that somehow the society has offended the gods, so if they can find out the reason why they offended the gods and rectify that, the plague will end. So Oedipus sends out multiple people to try to consult with oracles and prophets, which would be common at the time, including Oedipus's own brother-in-law, which he sends out, to try to find the reason of the plague. And everybody comes back saying that it's Oedipus himself who is the reason for the plague. And he's horrified, and he's filled with anger and paranoia, assuming people want to steal his throne. And the reality is that as the backstory unfolds in the play, Oedipus indeed is responsible for the plague. And what we find out how goes all the way back to Oedipus's birth parents. That when Oedipus was first born, his parents went to an oracle to get their future. And the oracle told them terrible things, that their son would kill their mother, or I'm sorry, would kill their father and marry their mother. And the parents, horrified, give Oedipus the baby to a servant to kill Oedipus so that that prophecy doesn't come to fruition. The servant takes pity on the baby and instead abandons the baby rather than kills it. And the abandoned baby is found by a servant of another kingdom. And the other servant brings the baby to that king and queen, who are overjoyed because they don't have children of their own. They decide to raise that baby as their own and never let that baby know that that baby was not their biological son. That baby eventually grows up to be Oedipus the man. And then Oedipus the man at one point goes to see a prophet to get his future, which again was common. And what he's told is that he has a horrible future in store for him, that he will kill his father and marry his mother. And Oedipus, horrified, decides that he's going to do whatever he can in his power to prevent this. So he decides to leave the people who he thinks are his biological parents and to travel as far away as possible. On his travels, at a crossroads, that'll be literal and also figurative, a chariot blocks his way, and in a fit of anger, Oedipus kills everyone in the chariot. And yes, it turns out one of those men happened to be his biological father. And perhaps, as one of my students noted, the earliest literary example of road rage that might exist. And then Oedipus approaches a kingdom that is being ravaged by plague, a kingdom that's just recently lost their king, by the way. And this plague is the result of a sphinx, a terrible monstrosity. And in great literary tradition, one of the ways that you oftentimes defeat monstrosity is by solving a riddle. And no one is bright enough to solve the riddle, but Oedipus is. The riddle, by the way, is what walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 3 in the evening. The answer being man. 4 legs in the morning would be a baby crawling. 2 legs in the afternoon would be an adult walking. 3 legs in the evening would be an elderly person with a cane. Because Oedipus is so intelligent, he's able to solve the riddle, he's able to eliminate the plague, and he also gets as a reward the kingdom because their king has been recently deceased, and that also means that he gets the newly widowed queen. And it turns out that Oedipus marries her and has children with her, And of course, that is also Oedipus's biological mother. So after all of this unfolds in the play, of course, the horrors are huge. Oedipus and his wife slash mother, Jocasta, respond quite differently. His wife slash mother decides to commit suicide because of the horrors, and Oedipus punishes himself instead, and he basically gouges out his eyes because his eyes have betrayed him. So at the ending of the play, Oedipus has insight, but he's blind, which is a comparable place to the prophet that Oedipus had consulted. He was literally blind, but he had insight. His name is Tiresias, this prophet. And then Oedipus is exiled, and it turns out his brother-in-law, who Oedipus had accused of basically trying to steal his kingdom, is now ruling the kingdom. And then Oedipus wanders off, even though he's a young man, with a cane. So he's walking on the three legs that the prophecy would have foretold, even though he's not yet an old man. And that would be the ending of Oedipus the King. If you're curious about the second play, because this is a trilogy, Antigone. Antigone is the story of Oedipus's daughter, who's now an adult, and we revisit Creon, who's still king, Oedipus's former brother-in-law. Creon is a very different character. In Oedipus the King, he's filled with hubris and anger and paranoia. In many respects, he becomes like Oedipus in the first play, which begs the question of what happens to an individual when they're given power. Does absolute power corrupt absolutely? The third play, Oedipus at Colonus, is the story of Oedipus as an old man who's been wandering in exile with his cane, the third leg, and has he suffered enough to appease the gods? So, but again, we're focusing on the first play, and we're going to be seeing a production that's going to be seemingly quite odd, because what they try to do was to duplicate as much as possible what we would have experienced in 430 BC. So you will get to see those padded costumes. You will get to see those exaggerated movements. It's almost like watching a silent film where everything is so exaggerated. But again, think about how it would seem to you if you were in a 14,000 seat amphitheater and you were seated all the way in the back. So obviously those are stage conventions that would be a necessity because of the limitations of theater. But I wanted to try to give you a performance that would duplicate as much as possible. Not that we've got necessarily eyewitnesses to verify, but at least based on the scholarship that's been done, to duplicate as much as possible what we would have experienced in 430 BC. So that's the next class. So this is why I wanted to fill you in on the plot, because the audience would have known the plot, and you're given the plot in the textbook as well. But as we are moving forward, as I indicated with Oedipus, you are writing a paper, and your attendance question for today is about what you think you will write paper number 1 on. Again, you're not necessarily committed to this, but I want you to start thinking about this. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class with Oedipus the King. Take care. Bye-bye.